along the way. What's the problem with that?
Yeah, so my worry with that sort of view, because again, transformism here is just an old-fashioned term for the claim that organisms can gradually transform into other sorts of organisms through the generations, right? As Darwin's theory claims. My worry with that is, again, when does one thing become another species? Is that an arbitrary division of our minds, as Darwin is very clear that he thinks? Or are there real divisions? Are there real joints in nature, that nature really is disjointed? Aquinas' metaphysics in ethics is so dependent on this notion of real, knowable, identifiable natures. So to say that all differences in nature are only a matter of degree, and then we arbitrarily call one cats and the other one dogs, that's just not, first of all, that's to defy common sense. I mean, I think genuinely we're just built to identify those different kinds of things, their different forms. But it also destroys, I think, Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, because to say that everything around us simply differs in its accidents rather than in its essential nature, in these accidents that just could be otherwise, that seems like what they're saying here is that if you have enough accidental changes, you get like a change in the kind of thing it is. That sounds to me like just a denial that there are fixed natures, because anything can potentially be anything else by just changing some accidental properties. So why not, in my view, why not just abandon the notion of form and essence? Why not just see the world as the scientific? If you're going to go that route, I just think be a scientific, view the world like a scientific materialist. There's nothing but a bunch of, matter moving around, atoms glomming onto other atoms and making interesting patterns over time, but there's no real fixed nature here. So that defies everyday observation about stable natures, and it certainly undermines the claim of traditional metaphysics. If everything gradually morphs into everything else, then what we call species, or the natural kind, is, as we said earlier, just an arbitrary snapshot of what it looks like right now. But if we were thinking historically, we'd see that it all just blends into everything else, and all we mean by cats is this little slice on a gradual continuum. There's no essence to what it really is to be a cat.
It's really common to hear the debate oversimplified here, where you'll encounter someone, often of an intellectual bent, who will say that Christians have always recognized that God works through secondary causes, meaning he doesn't do things directly and miraculously all the time. He does them through creation. And, Augustine observed that the Bible is not a science textbook, and so we can just adopt Darwinism wholeheartedly and say that was how God did it. What's the actual theological price tag on making that sort of move? Is it even possible?
Ooh, that's a great question. Those are the two main platitudes, aren't they? I mean, Augustine said that the Bible's not a science textbook, as though no one knew that.
Well, you always get people saying, "Oh, the Church Fathers were totally okay with evolution, like Augustine and Augustine and Augustine." And when you ask them to cite the passage, they're always like, well, there was this one thing he said about maybe God created the world in one instant instead of 6 days or whatever. But it's not. We never get many specifics on exactly what he said and why he would have been okay with Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And of course, Augustine talks about these seminal reasons that maybe God implants reasons that sort of unfold over time. Whatever that is certainly not Darwinian evolution, where the end is built into the organisms themselves and unfolds over time, like a flower in its own development, right? Whatever that is, that it could be some kind of evolution, but it's definitely not a Darwinian evolution. And my plea for Christians is, well, if that's your view, just be clear about it. You're an evolutionist, but you're not a Darwinian. And to your larger point, what price do we pay theologically for thinking everything is just God only acts through secondary causes. He doesn't really ever primarily directly act in creation. Well, I think the price we pay for that is that we become deists, right? And then if you want to say, well, I'm not a deist, I believe in the virgin birth, well, then it looks totally arbitrary, right? If God is never doing anything in creation except for a random miracle here or there, it just, again, feels like a very disjointed worldview to me. So on the Thomistic end, the way this argument usually develops is to say, well, listen, we are not, as Thomists, we're not occasionalists, meaning like many of the Arab Islamic philosophers thought that creatures don't really cause anything. Only God causes things, and it looks like creatures cause things. Creatures are just the occasion for God to act directly all the time. St. Thomas clearly rejects that view and says, no, both God and creatures can both be true causes. And in fact, at the same time, they can both be true causes of an event. Which is hard to understand, but we can unpack that. But they move from the fact that we shouldn't be occasionalists and think God is the only one who can cause anything to this idea that nature is just fully autonomous and acts on its own. That is not whatever St. Thomas's view is. That is not it, right? St. Thomas thinks that God creates things directly. He does think that God gives things orderly natures and that creatures sort of have a dignity that they can participate in God's causal power, that they can sort of participate, that in him we live and move and have our being. We participate in his causality, and it really is ours and his in some sense. But also, St. Thomas could not be more clear that God sometimes just works apart from the orderly natures he's given to things. St. Thomas says in the Summa Contra Gentiles that God does this precisely to show us that he is free and that his power is not his choices and power are not necessitated, but that he acts freely as a dignified agent and that he is in charge of all creation.
Another way of getting at this is talking about Aristotle's four causes as Thomas employs them. So you would give such a better summary of the whole idea than I would. So go ahead and summarize for us what the four causes are, and then which of those does a standard account of Darwinian evolution do away with?
Yeah, good. So the four causes, it's a weird term to call these causes, but we can think of them loosely as four explanations. Aristotle notes that there are four basic types of explanations we give whenever we ask, why is something the way it is? He thinks you can give there are actually four questions there, and that we can differentiate why something is the way it is in four different senses. So he calls these material, efficient, formal, and final causes. So a material cause or a material explanation is just the stuff of which something is made, right? So the wood of the tree and so forth. Or at the lower level, it could be atoms, things like that. The efficient cause, right, is whatever produced it in action. So I take it that, the parent plant and so forth could produce the tree through natural generation. The formal cause is just its form, as we've been talking about. Its form is, in this case, like in organisms, he calls the form a soul. He doesn't mean like a spiritual soul for everything. He doesn't think ants have like a rational or spiritual soul. He just means they have a sort of intrinsic principle that makes them the way they are and lets them move themselves, right? Like rocks and other things are moved from the outside, whereas creatures and organisms, they have the ability to move themselves from the inside. They have an intrinsic unfolding, right? A sort of developmental biological path. And so they have a formal cause making them alive and making them the kind of thing they are. And then lastly, as we've said, they have a final cause. That's just the teleological cause there. The final cause is what you're meant for, your characteristic activities and your way of life. So I take it for a human being, your material cause would be flesh and bones, or at the lower level, various, molecules and all the way down to atoms and so forth. Your efficient cause would be your parents who produced you, or sperm and egg that produced you through a kind of action and union. The formal cause would be the human rational soul. And then the final cause for Aristotle would be to live a good rational life. Like reason is what makes us distinctive, so we ought to live a good rational life. Thomas would, of course, add that we also have a supernatural end there of knowing and loving God and enjoying him forever. So Darwinism, like most of modern thought, Darwinism isn't unique in this, but most of modern thought tends to deny the last two. The idea that there are forms and purposes, that there's sort of a plan and purpose in creation. Rather, everything is just sort of dumb matter. It has no real essence or goal or purpose. And it's just a bunch of simple things glomming onto each other, making different shapes over time. There's not really a way it's supposed to be. It doesn't have a fixed nature, let alone purposes and goals. It's not really for anything.
We've been doing a promotion for Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, at the Colson Center. And I just enjoyed that book tremendously. But one of the points he makes, he actually points to Darwin as a key player in the development of the modern self that led to the sexual revolution and the transgender movement. And he latches on to this idea of the loss of formal and final causation in human nature, especially, where if we look at human beings as the product of a series of accidents, then we are in the place that Nietzsche's madman said we are, where we've killed God, meaning we've disproved him, and now we get to reinvent ourselves along whatever lines we choose, because there is no teleology, there is no purpose, there is no goal for humanity normatively. Our goal is purely utilitarian survival, and if that's the truth, then that means we can become whoever we want to be, and that means that even things like sex and gender are merely epiphenomena of evolution. They're not sort of normative. They're not a design that anyone came up with. And we can tinker with them and change them as we will. These things, I mean, we talk about going upstream on this podcast. These ideas may sound esoteric. They may sound like, you know, a bunch of 50-cent philosophical words strung together. But in reality, they have massive ethical implications, even for people who've, you know, never read the upstream philosophers.
Oh, I couldn't agree with that more, and I think that Nietzsche's the right reference there. So think about it. We enter this Enlightenment period, and we're told that we don't really need God to do as much anymore, and eventually we don't need God to do anything on into the 19th century. And notice what happens. We were told it was going to the Enlightenment was going to be the era of reason, right? But what ends up happening is that because we deny that we have this sort of rational nature, will or our choices end up getting elevated over reason. And so Nietzsche says, why should anything be greater than my own choices? There's nothing constraining me. There's no nature. There's no way I'm supposed to be or ought to be. So there's no God, and that means I don't have a fixed nature or way I'm supposed to be. Therefore, he says the master, the sort of the great men, he says, are those who choose their own values, who make their will primary above all things. Because if God's not up there anymore, we just are the highest things. So why can't we, say whatever we want about sexuality, do whatever pleases us? There's nothing constraining us. There's nothing above us at all. Not even, and by the way, it's not just that there's no God. There's not even any nature above us that constrains us. It's just down to raw will and power. And I would submit, by the way, if that sounds attractive to anyone out there, they haven't thought it through very well, right? Because that just means that we can't reason with each other toward the truth. All that's left is fisticuffs, right? I mean, all that's left is power.
So we've gotten to this point now where, and I believe this is the case, that these philosophical objections that we can marshal commit Christians to not embracing Darwinism as it's marketed in the scientific community predominantly, especially by the popularizers like Richard Dawkins. You just cannot harmonize that with Christianity. You have to, at the very least, modify it in some radical way. And one of the radical ways that it's been modified is the intelligent design movement, where you've got a lot of ID folks who are they're not in the Ken Ham camp, they're not young Earth creationists, but they're intermediate in some sense, where they're saying, I believe that modern geology teaches about the age of the Earth and so forth, but I don't buy the Darwinian synthesis on how, or the neo-Darwinian synthesis on exactly how life came to be. It clearly evinces teleology, intelligence, and perhaps even intervention. There's a goal there. But I've run into this objection that's very, very common. It's probably the most common objection to the intelligent design movement. And it's that this is really a God of the gaps argument, or more formally, it's an argument from ignorance. And even Christians, especially Christians at times, will often say this in order to sort of distance themselves from those guys who lost the court case in Texas a while back. What do you make of that claim? Does it really succeed as a critique of intelligent design?
Yeah, good question. That is probably the most common charge that we hear, which, by the way, isn't it interesting that the most common charge is a kind of philosophical charge, not really battling on the scientific evidence itself? I think that actually should tell us something. But I think this is an incredibly weak charge. It simply just isn't. It just isn't how idea arguments work, right? Idea arguments, whether you think they're successful or not, doesn't really matter. They're made by serious scientists and serious philosophers of science who really do understand the logic of arguments. So idea theorists do often critique Darwinian theory and the power of the selection mutation mechanism, but they don't simply then conclude, so there must be a designer, right? Darwin doesn't work, there must be a designer. That isn't how their arguments work. Rather, they consistently argue not only from the failure of Darwinian theory, but from the presence of hallmarks of intelligent design, that there's positive evidence there. You and I had spoken earlier about Stephen Meyer, right, who's very involved in the intelligent design movement at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. He has a new book called The Return of the God Hypothesis. And if you look carefully at pretty much any ID work, but especially, say, a new work like that, it's just so clear that what they're arguing from are positive signs of intelligence, say in DNA or in the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and so on and so forth. They're not just saying, well, I have no idea what made this, God done it, right? Like, no one says that. That's obviously so ridiculous. Because an argument from ignorance or God of the gaps argument is supposed to be a weak argument because you don't have positive evidence. You just throw up your hands and say, God done it. That's just false, really. But I guess I'd note that it isn't. It also, by the way, I like to push people on whether gaps arguments are always bad arguments. I mean, isn't it a perfectly good way to reason to say, hey, there's a huge gap in your theory. You can't account for X, Y, and Z. My theory accounts really nicely for X, Y, and Z. That's actually a very common and a very good way to argue. So, number one, idea arguments are not mere gaps arguments. Number two, gaps arguments are not always bad. If anything, the shoe is on the other foot here. It seems to me that critics of ID very often, they just think, okay, in nature we don't see any evidence of God at all, but we just sort of posit him through faith or in a fideistic way or something like that. In a weird way, that's the kind of, they're making this strange addition. So yeah, I think the shoe's kind of on the other foot here.
Well, you could even say that about naturalists in a way, where there's an evolution of the gaps argument that takes place, where it's like, we don't understand how the first life form arose to get the evolutionary process started. And I had James Tour on the program a while back to talk about that. And we'll just get this promissory note that says, at some future date, we'll be able to explain the process, but you just need to accept it on faith that it did come about through material processes. Well, says who? That's not a scientific conclusion. That's a philosophical assertion of naturalism there.
Yeah, and then that leads to, right, so the very origins of the ID movement itself, right, lie in the great legal scholar Philip Johnson. And what Philip Johnson constantly pointed out when he started to look into this evolution controversy, he said, wait a minute, it looks like all the work is being done by this presupposition that we just can't ever really talk about God or anything like God in science. In other words, we assume naturalism from the beginning, and then we create a rule called methodological naturalism, where you're not really allowed to talk about God or anything supernatural. We're not allowed to talk even about a generic designer in science. And then you somehow say, because you've excluded him from the beginning, that you've disproven God with science or something. When you really just excluded him from the very beginning, it's very circular, right? Start with naturalism. Science can't talk about God, and then somehow science has proven there's no God. Well, how could science do that if science can't talk about God at all?
Yeah, it's like Hans Feeney's Lutheran satire video with Donald and Connell talking to Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins is like, well, we know that Jesus didn't rise from the dead because people don't rise from the dead, and they're like, yeah, except for that time Jesus rose from the dead, and then he goes, hey Donald, I just proved that there's no such thing as barium. How did you do that, Connell? By throwing out all the samples of barium, and it's it's a completely circular argument they're making. Let's move to, because we're coming up to the end of our time here, I want to hit a more sophisticated version of this, popularized by Christian philosophers like Dr. Ed Feser, who make the objection that ID confuses organisms in the Thomistic sense, so things that have forms or essences, with artifacts, which have none. The artifacts are things that humans make, right? Like the watch that Paley talked about, or a car, or a pen. And he points to, of course, Paley's argument as exemplary of this. Is it appropriate to compare organisms with artifacts? I mean, you talk about how Thomas does that. And how would you respond as a proponent of ID?
Yeah, good. I think this misses the mark for sure. I mean, Feser is a very capable and gifted Thomistic philosopher, right? We should note that, of course. But I think this just totally misses the mark. And I don't know why, but Ed Feser just has like kind of bee in his bonnet about ID. He really wants to distance Thomism from it. I think this is mostly, again, cultural, that sophisticated people aren't supposed to like design arguments. We're supposed to all be Darwinians. And so if we associate Thomism with ID, then I think people are worried Thomism is going to be brought down and so forth. Now, his worry seems to be, if we try to parse it out, that Paley and ID conceptualize God on the model of a human tinkerer, and hence we anthropomorphize God, right? We make God sort of an artificer rather than the sort of ground of all being and the general creator of natures or something like that. But of course, first of all, ID theorists just don't do anything like that. They aren't making any grand claims about metaphysics. I don't know why he would say this. I do think he kind of just misunderstands Paley and ID here. They're both arguing that God's the best explanation of certain features of the universe and the living world. But that doesn't tell us at all how God created, or the mode or the manner, via tinkering or an evolutionary process or anything else. I mean, the fundamental claim of ID is that we can know from nature that there was an intelligence involved in this process. The claim isn't that we know exactly how it happened, or that God made every living individual thing, separately and so forth. That's just not ID arguments. So in regards to the anthropomorphic charge, I think Fazer objects I think he objects to people like us that we talk about God as a designer, and maybe in his mind that implies God's sort of this artificer who's tinkering around with things. He argues that God, doesn't design things; he just creates their general nature, and that again sounds like God just kind of creates in general and then lets it go. But I can't figure out why he can't do both. Why can't God create natures and also sometimes specifically be involved in the world? His great hero, as you said, Thomas Aquinas, says that God's the supreme artist, and in fact says that God, that all things are like artifacts of the divine mind. So Aquinas isn't as much of an Aristotelian, I think, as Fazer is. Aquinas wasn't worried about blurring the distinction between nature and art. So for Aristotle, right, there was a kind of division. Nature has a kind of intrinsic principle by which it changes and is what it is. Things that we make, artificial things, we just kind of staple things together from the outside, or hammer and nails together, right? We sort of put things together like my kids do in my garage. And so my kids don't really create a thing with a nature. It's true that there's a division. You can tell
because those things don't heal themselves, they don't reproduce, They don't do any of that. They just break down after a while.
That's right. But for Thomas, God does both. I mean, he's the ground of all being. He specifically creates the natures of things. And they naturally generate things after their kind. But then God is very often also specifically involved in the natural world directly and primarily, as he says, to show that he's not constrained by creation, but that he's authoritative over it. So I think Fazer, like many Thomists, is just bothered by the claim of some ID theorists that God's active in the creative world, that God doesn't always and everywhere only work through natural processes. But Aquinas is just not worried about that. So whatever is the merit of any of these accusations against ID, I mean, I certainly don't think very highly of that kind of accusation. It just looks to me like a Thomist trying to be more Thomistic than Thomas. I'm sure you deal with this, right, with Calvinists trying to be more Calvinist than John Calvin and so forth.
Man, yes.
There's those that happens everywhere, and I think this is a great example of that. But it never ceases to amaze me that the charges primarily are not that Michael Behe got some math wrong somewhere. The charges are not that Robin Collins is wrong about, the weak nuclear force being fine-tuned. The charge is not that Steve Meyer doesn't even understand how DNA works. The charge is always some weird theological kind of abstract, theological or philosophical charge like this. And I think that should tell us a whole lot about this debate. The ID arguments are not being engaged at the primary level of evidence. They're being engaged by these like meta-philosophical critiques. And it turns out I just think the philosophical critiques are extremely weak. If there's a problem with ID, it's going to be at the level of argument itself.
Sometimes it's even an aesthetic critique, if anything. I saw a very sharp observation on Twitter a while back by a theistic evolutionist who said, look, I buy the theistic evolutionary view. However, I'm also persuaded that a lot of theistic evolutionists are motivated primarily by the desire to minimize miracles in history, to limit God to one big miracle at the beginning, because number one, they're probably embarrassed to admit that they believe in an interventionist God, and number two, because they have this sense of aesthetics where it would be somehow more elegant for God to just front load the whole thing and then for it to unfold over time. But even then, they're not being entirely honest, because in saying, well, that's just evolution as Darwin taught it. No, it's not. God planting a giant seed with the teleology of all creatures in it, and that gradually unfolding over millions of years is not Darwinian evolution. It's emphatically the opposite.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so there's two things there. One is people are so afraid of any possible conflict between science and the claims of Christian faith. And I understand that because we've been fed this naturalistic narrative about how Christianity's always been against science, and the Catholic Church persecutes Galileo and blah blah blah, and almost everything we know there is not true. And by the way, was invented in the late 19th century. It's not even very recent stories. The flat Earth myth, the Galileo was tortured. Voltaire says this, and so on and so forth. It's all false. But we have what I call a Galileo complex, right? That we're just so afraid that, oh no, because we did this bad thing to Galileo, which by the way we didn't really do. The story is just way more complicated than that. We're just so afraid of any engagement, and I guess here's what I worry about, that in that regard, we don't have the courage of our convictions, that the Christian worldview is really true, and that it can actually live up to modern science. We're so afraid that we could possibly find something in science. We don't want there to be anything that we could find in science that would count against God. I'm willing to put my chips on the table. Like, I think either Christian theism is true or it's not, and I'm really convinced that it is, and I'm convinced that we have the better of the evidence, and I'm willing to wager that in the future, I'm willing for there to be conflict, because I think that we can win it at the evidential level. So I think there's a lack of courage and conviction here. And so what we do is we seek to put science and faith in these hermetically sealed boxes so they can't even possibly conflict, so that then we can never lose. And then to your aesthetic point, I actually feel some sympathy for that view, right? That wouldn't it just be beautiful if God created this system and then it just all unfolded? But like you said, number one, that's just not Darwinism. That's a version of intelligent design. Number two, as Christians, we're committed to all kinds of so-called interventions by God, right? We're committed to all kinds of miracles. The foundation of our faith is the resurrection.
We had a donkey talk one time. I think the whole aesthetic thing has kind of gone out the window at this point.
Yeah, I think but here's what I found. So I actually did wrestle with this for a time, and what I concluded was that I just had a bad metaphor of God. First of all, the notion of intervention, as though God is, not only transcendent, but he's only transcendent, that he's not really here and present to us and intimate with us, that he has to sort of dive in from the outside and mess with something he never ordinarily messes with. If you're a Thomist, of course, you're thinking God is actively causing and sustaining all the things around us. So you shouldn't hold that weird view of God intervening. But also notice, what if we change the metaphor? Instead of God being this engineer out there who's now has to tinker with his creation, what if God's more like an artist? If you want to talk about the church fathers, right, as we were mentioning earlier, they see God as an artist. And if you think of God as sort of adding color and beauty and context, or to take the Tolkien metaphor, that God is sort of this conductor, right? Sort of singing all things into being at the precisely right moment to get the harmony and so forth. To me, that's very beautiful. And so this idea, I think it stems back from this weird, mechanical metaphor of nature, that it's really this big machine. This is ironic because the Thomists are always saying that we have this view as ID people. But I think the Thomist thinks that it's this big many Thomists think it's a big self-sustaining machine, and then God has to intervene in it. But if it's a more organic metaphor, that there's this beautiful organic development that God is creating, and that he's singing things into being and adding color, that to me is very beautiful. And it doesn't at all feel like God's poking his finger in the prebiotic soup, as they like to say, and so forth.
Well, C.S. Lewis deals with this so well in his book Miracles, and he confronts the very notion that God intervening would in some way be, like an intervention or an interference in history. Miracles aren't like that. He actually compares them to God bringing about processes that he normally brings about through the glove of nature, right? And then he just takes that glove off and does it directly. And that's a beautiful metaphor for the secondary causation that's normally at work. He always turns water into wine by, the normal process of grapes growing in the sun and creating sugar and fermentation with yeast and all that. But one day he decided to just take the glove off and do it. And Lewis explains miracles of I think he calls them miracles of the first creation that way. And then he has another category for miracles of the new creation, which are things like Christ's resurrection, where as N.T. Wright says, the future comes back into the past and just sort of colonizes our world with the kind of world that will one day exist. So yeah, there are a lot of far more beautiful and complicated ways of looking at this than that simple aesthetic instinct that we're talking about. Well, as much as I'd like to continue for another hour, we got to close out here. Dr. Logan Gage, where can my listeners go to find more of your work? Because this has been fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So my site is at franciscan.edu. I keep all my philosophical work and other work on philpapers.org. If you look for Logan Gage Phil Papers, you'll see stuff there.
Well, folks, my guest today has been Dr. Logan Gage, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and author of a chapter in God and Evolution, edited by Dr. Jay Richards. I hope you will check that book out, as well as the rest of Dr. Gage's work. Thank you so much for joining me today on Upstream, Dr. Gage. It's been a real illuminating discussion.
Thanks for having me, Shane. Appreciate it.